For over 2 decades, a network of U.S. military task forces has been quietly operating along and beyond America's southern border. They fuse DEA intelligence with military signals intercepts and satellite surveillance to map cartel leadership structures with the same precision used against al-Qaeda and ISIS, yet no senior official has ever publicly confirmed the full scope of their operations. Joint Task Force North, based at Fort Bliss, Texas. Joint Interagency. Task Force South, based in Key West, Florida, and classified JSOC cells, embedded within Northern Command and Southern Command, have collectively built the most comprehensive targeting architecture ever directed at narcotics organizations. After the February 2025 terrorist designations, these task forces were quietly authorized to shift from intelligence support to an operational posture. That means the hunting infrastructure was already built long before anyone gave the order to use it. At the edge of the Chihuahuan Desert, inside the sprawling perimeter of Fort Bliss, a command center operates in near anonymity. Joint Task Force North, called JTF North, sits just miles from the border, yet few outside military and law enforcement circles know its full purpose. Created in November 1989 under the National Defense Authorization Act, JTF North was born from a quiet directive signed by Army General Colin Powell, responding to the mounting pressure of the drug war along the southwest border. The order authorized the Department of Defense to support law enforcement in counter-drug missions, laying the groundwork for a new kind of military presence, one that blurred the line between domestic security and national defense. JTF North's headquarters at Biggs Army Airfield houses a joint service staff drawn from every branch, active duty, reservists, National Guard, and civilians, working side by side with federal agencies. Their area of responsibility once covered only the 4 border states, but by the mid-1990s it had expanded to the entire continental U.S., Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. The name changed in 2004, reflecting a broader mission under U.S. Northern Command. Today, the task force numbers around 2,500 personnel, orchestrating intelligence, logistics, and operations, but without its own combat troops. Instead, it acts as a NERVA center, fusing signals intelligence, surveillance feeds, and human reporting into actionable leads for law enforcement partners. A former commander describes the daily rhythm as relentless, tracking smuggling corridors, coordinating tunnel detection, and fielding requests from agencies like the DEA and Border Patrol. Over the decades, JTF North has supported more than 6,000 missions, helping to uncover hundreds of cross-border tunnels and disrupt billions in drug shipments. The task force's existence is rooted in the 1989 law, but its real power comes from the way it quietly connects military resources with civilian agencies, forming the first node in a wider architecture that now reaches across the hemisphere. Far from the U.S. border, another command center operates out of Key West, Florida. Joint Interagency Task Force South, JYATF South, controls an area of responsibility that stretches across 42 million square miles of ocean, nearly a tenth of the planet's surface. Here, the fight against drug trafficking plays out on a scale that dwarfs anything on land. The Caribbean, the Eastern Pacific, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Atlantic all fall under JPARA-TF South's watch, making it the largest maritime interdiction zone in the world. Rear Admiral Jeff Randall, the Coast Guard officer in charge, oversees a staff of around 1,200, drawn from every branch of the military, as well as intelligence agencies and civilian analysts. The command is more than just American. It brings together liaison officers from 20 nations, including Colombia, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Spain. On any given day, Dutch frigates, Colombian patrol boats, and U.S. Navy ships share intelligence in real time, coordinating their movements to intercept traffickers moving by go-fast boat, semi-submersible, or commercial freighter. The asset mix is formidable. 12 P-3 Orion surveillance planes, 4 littoral combat ships, Coast Guard cutters, and a rotating fleet of Allied vessels. Each year, JIATF South orchestrates thousands of sorties and patrols, tracking vessels suspected of carrying cocaine, fentanyl precursors, and other illicit cargo. In fiscal year 2023 alone, these operations led to the seizure of over 300 metric tons of narcotics, roughly 9% of all maritime cocaine flow from South America. JIATF. South's multinational framework is not just about sharing radar feeds or satellite imagery. It is a standing coalition, built for speed and scale, where legal authorities and intelligence agreements allow for rapid handoffs between countries. This structure enables the task force to pursue traffickers across vast stretches of open water, well beyond any single nation's jurisdiction. The reach and capacity on display here set the stage for what happens when counter-narcotics missions are given the authority and tools of counterterrorism operations. Congress set the financial boundaries for these task forces through Section 284 of Title 10, which quietly channels over $1.2 billion each year into the Department of Defense's counter-drug programs. This funding pays for a sprawling inventory, ground-penetrating radar units, sensor networks, unmanned aircraft, and joint training with law enforcement. Along the southwest border, more than 150 ground-penetrating radar systems are deployed to scan for tunnels, and over 250 cross-border tunnels have been discovered and mapped since the early 2000s. In the air, MQ-9, Reaper, and Predator Sea drones fly thousands of sorties annually, gathering intelligence across Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. At sea, a dozen P-3 Orion surveillance planes and 4 littoral combat ships patrol the hemisphere's busiest smuggling lanes, contributing to hundreds of vessel interceptions every year. Despite the scale, the numbers reveal a ceiling on what these programs achieve. In 2023, JIATF South and its partners seized just over 300 metric tons of narcotics, amounting to roughly 8 to 15% of the estimated maritime cocaine flow from South America. The remaining majority slips through, rerouted by traffickers who adapt as fast as the sensors can find them. The tunnel detection effort faces similar limits. Each new discovery often leads to another hidden passage, as cartels shift their routes and methods. The budget, while vast, is spread thin across technology upgrades, maintenance, and training, leaving little room for expansion without new authorities or legal mandates. Section 284's fiscal mechanism defines not only the scope of U.S. military counter-narcotics operations, but also their constraints. The task forces can support, train, and equip, but they cannot cross certain legal lines. No direct action, no unilateral arrests, no kinetic strikes. These boundaries shape the architecture's effectiveness, setting a measurable limit on what can be accomplished with the tools and authorities currently in hand. Deep inside the command structure of U.S. Northern Command and U.S. Southern Command, a different kind of unit operates beyond the reach of public oversight. Since 2002, small teams of intelligence professionals, drawn from the Joint Special Operations Command, have worked in sealed compartments, their names absent from any official roster. These cells blend Tier 1 special operators, signals analysts, cyber specialists, and legal counsel. Their task is to map, track, and enable the targeting of cartel networks using a method borrowed from counterterrorism. The backbone of their approach is known as F3EA: find, fix, finish, exploit, assess. Originally developed to dismantle terrorist cells in Iraq and Afghanistan, this 5-step cycle was quietly adapted for the drug war. The process begins with data: intercepted phone calls, geospatial mapping, and financial transactions. Analysts use custom platforms like Cartel Map to sift through signals intelligence and satellite imagery, isolating the logistical hubs or safe houses that anchor a cartel's operations. Once a target is identified, the cell moves to fix its location. This might involve deploying unmanned aircraft for real-time surveillance, or queuing ground-penetrating radar teams to confirm the presence of a tunnel or stash site. Every step is documented, every movement logged, with legal advisors reviewing each action for compliance with standing authorities. The cells do not conduct raids or strikes themselves. Instead, they assemble targeting packets, dossiers that include location, pattern of life, and risk assessments, then pass these to law enforcement or, in rare cases, to military partners cleared for action. After an operation, the cycle continues. The team reviews forensic evidence, analyzes seized electronics, and assesses the impact. Did the operation disrupt a trafficking route? Did it trigger shifts in cartel communications or finances? The answers feed back into the system, refining the next round of targeting. For over 2 decades, these cells have remained in the shadows, acting as the unseen architects behind many of the most sophisticated counter-cartel operations, always operating at the edge of what the law allows. Long before the first military task force set up shop at Fort Bliss or Key West, the legal and strategic groundwork was being laid in Washington. In 1988, President Reagan signed National Security Decision Directive 221. This directive called the international narcotics trade a direct threat to U.S. national security, moving the drug war out of the realm of ordinary crime and into the world of national defense. For the first time, policy drafters at the White House and the Pentagon were told to treat cartels as more than just criminal syndicates. They became adversaries in a new kind of conflict that justified the use of military intelligence and interagency cooperation. Directive 221 did not just change the language, it opened the door for the Department of Defense to use its full intelligence arsenal. Signals intelligence teams, once focused on Soviet targets, began intercepting cartel communications in the Andes and the Caribbean. The proof of concept came in the early 1990s, when a small, secretive army unit known as Centra Spike played a quiet but decisive role in Colombia. Using airborne platforms and ground stations, Centra Spike intercepted phone calls and radio traffic linked to Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel. The information they gathered was shared with Colombian authorities and DEA agents, guiding raids, narrowing search grids, and eventually helping to corner Escobar in Medellin in December 1993. The success of Centra Spike set a precedent. It showed that military-grade intelligence could tip the scales in drug enforcement, even across international borders. The lessons learned in Colombia about fusing signals, sharing data, and building joint targeting teams became templates for future U.S. task forces. By the time Congress passed the 1989 National Defense Authorization Act, the machinery was in place for the Department of Defense to step into the drug war with legal authority and operational experience. The architecture that now operates across the hemisphere owes much to those early experiments and to the policy architects who saw the cartel threat as a matter of national security. On February 20th, 2025, a new executive order landed on the president's desk. The document, signed that afternoon, invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and designated 8 Mexican cartels as both foreign terrorist organizations and specially designated global terrorists. The legal language was precise. These groups now faced the same restrictions, asset freezes, and military authorities once reserved for Al-Qaeda and ISIS. For the first time, U.S. military task forces received written permission to apply Title X counterterrorism rules of engagement against cartel targets. Within hours, the Pentagon's legal advisors assembled a joint targeting board. Their task was to review intelligence packets, weigh the risk of civilian harm, and authorize action under the new rules. The shift was immediate and visible. The traditional protocols, including warning shots, boarding, and seizure, were replaced by a framework that allowed lethal force when a credible, imminent threat was identified. The board's first case arrived just days later, a Sinaloa cartel training camp in the Sierra Madre Occidental, flagged as a hub for fentanyl production and armed protection teams. The operation unfolded before dawn. A drone strike, cleared through the new legal channels, targeted the compound. When the dust settled, forensic teams confirmed the deaths of 11 high-value cartel operatives. 2 civilian casualties were reported, an outcome that triggered a mandatory after-action review and a round of questions from oversight panels in Congress. The strike's results were logged in a classified report and presented to the National Security Council within 48 hours. A timeline now traces the evolution from support to direct action. 1989, the first counter-drug task force. 2023, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance-driven interdictions. 2025, the first kinetic strike under counterterrorism authorities. Legal experts, former JAG officers, national security scholars, and a retired federal judge appear on camera, dissecting the executive order's language and the chain of command. Their analysis frames the event not just as a military milestone, but as a legal and ethical turning point for U.S. counter-narcotics policy. The morning after the first authorized strike, President Claudia Sheinbaum stood before reporters in Mexico City, her voice resolute. She condemned the U.S. action as a violation of Mexican sovereignty, demanding an immediate halt to any further unilateral military operations and insisting on a formal bilateral oversight process. Within hours, the Mexican Senate convened emergency hearings, debating the creation of a joint oversight council to monitor all U.S. operations on Mexican soil. Lawmakers from across the political spectrum denounced the lack of advance notice and warned that continued strikes could jeopardize security cooperation agreements that had taken decades to build. The shock rippled far beyond Mexico. Colombia's defense minister called the new U.S. authorities a potential force multiplier, but cautioned that any expansion of kinetic strikes would require close coordination to avoid diplomatic fallout. In Central America, leaders from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador released a joint statement expressing concern about civilian harm and the precedent set by foreign military action in the region. Canada signaled support for counter-narcotics efforts, but stressed the need for strict adherence to international humanitarian law. Inside the U.S., congressional committees called senior Pentagon officials to testify on the decision-making process and oversight mechanisms. Lawmakers pressed for details on civilian casualty protocols and demanded assurances that the expanded rules of engagement would not spiral into open-ended conflict. The diplomatic rift exposed the fragile balance between security imperatives and the sovereignty of America's closest partners, raising questions about the long-term cost of treating cartels as military adversaries. Lawmakers and civil society monitors are now pressing for answers. The data from the past year shows a clear pattern. As high-value targets fall, the cartel fragmentation index has climbed from 0.32 to 0.41. This number, drawn from network analysis of cartel splintering, signals a measurable rise in intra-cartel violence and succession disputes. Experts point to the aftermath of direct action strikes. Removing kingpins often fractures organizations, spawning rival factions that fight for control. In several Mexican states, homicide rates have risen by double digits since the first kinetic operations. Congressional oversight has struggled to keep pace. The Government Accountability Office recently identified persistent gaps in civilian casualty reporting and inconsistent documentation of legal waivers for strikes. Current statutes require annual budget tables, but there is no mandated system for tracking civilian harm or the long-term effects of task force actions. These shortcomings have fueled calls for reform. Policy advocates propose a checklist of actionable oversight measures, quarterly classified briefings to the House and Senate Armed Services Committees, mandatory civilian impact assessments for every kinetic action, and a bilateral joint oversight council with Mexico to review pre-strike notifications and post-strike outcomes. Legal scholars urge amendments to Section 284, requiring congressional concurrence for each waiver of direct action authority. Civil society groups demand independent after-action reviews whenever civilian harm occurs, and a shift of 20% of counter-drug funding toward capacity building for partner law enforcement. These reforms aim to balance operational effectiveness with transparency and accountability, closing the gap between military power and democratic oversight. Today, military counter-narcotics operations blur the line between war and law enforcement, often without public oversight. As new authorities expand covert powers, questions outpace answers about accountability, legality, and unintended consequences. The fight now runs silent, and its reach is growing. When national security tools turn inward, democracy's checks matter more than ever. What boundaries do we defend when the battlefield is no longer overseas? Let me know your perspective in the comments.